As Theo just said, we're going to have a short discussion, therefore I will try to keep my remarks to half an hour plus translation, but this is just me trying, it's not a promise. And also I will try to make short sentences or half sentences for the translators, so it is not too complicated for you. Now, comrades, for a Marxist organization, a discussion on perspectives is a guide to action. We do not analyze events and prospects for the sake of it or as an academic activity. We do this to draw conclusions from it for our program, our tactics, our intervention into the class struggle. And therefore the first thing which I want to do is to ask you to come into the discussion with your experiences, your ideas, criticisms, proposals, questions. Because only if we draw the different experiences and ideas of our comrades and sections together, we will be able to come to correct conclusions for the practical activity to successfully build the organization. And if we look at the situation in Europe today, the need for a mass socialist revolutionary organization is probably the outstanding phenomena. Really, all the negative developments in regard to the rise of the populist right, the limits of the class struggle, the decline of many of the left parties is all down to the underdeveloped consciousness of the masses, to the betrayals of reformism, and to the lack of mass socialist workers' parties and revolutionary parties. Now, many others on the left have a one-sided and pessimistic view on developments. For them, this year, the different elections are just a shift to the right, just the strengthening of right-wing populist forces, just an increase in racism, just an increase in the undemocratic methods of governments by the rulers. We as Marxists are dialecticians, which means we see all events in processes, as processes. We look at them from all sides, and we look at the direction they are moving to, and we look under the surface. And if we do that, there is only one conclusion we can draw, and I will start my contribution with the conclusion. The future will see instability, polarization, upheavals, class battles, leaps in consciousness, new phenomena, crisis to which the instability, polarization, class battles, crisis of the last years were like a gentle breeze in comparison to a thunderstorm. And this is what we have to prepare for the thunderstorms of the capitalist crisis and for the thunderstorms of the class struggle which are about to come. This is what we have to prepare ourselves for collectively as an international. This is what every section, every group has to prepare for. And this is what every single comrade has to prepare himself or herself for. And I hope that this school and the discussion, also this discussion on Europe, will help in that preparation. And I'm sure that the discussion will mainly focus on political developments and the class struggle. The different elections, the rise of the populist right, strikes, developments in the trade unions, and so on. But we must never forget that the ultimate basis for all these developments is the economic situation. And the economic situation in Europe, whether it is the EU, the UK, or other non-EU states, is simply not good. And it is as bad as the situation of world capitalism, or maybe worse, which we have discussed on Sunday. And in the resolution of the last IEC on Europe, this is summarized in the sentence, Europe is marked by weak growth, continued high inflation, low productivity growth, and low investment. There's almost nothing worse for capitalism to be there. And I remember that in January, when I wrote that sentence, I read an article in the bourgeois press which was excited about the strong performance of the French economy. It did not give figures, and I was a bit confused, and then I checked the figures. And at the time, they were expecting something like 1% growth for France. So 1% growth for France was enough for the bourgeois commentators to get positively excited. And that really says all about the state of capitalism in Europe today. But as we've heard in Leila's contribution on Sunday, this forecast was probably over-optimistic. Because Leila said that this year France is most likely to end up in a recession. The German economy is between recession and stagnation. And in the words of the finance minister of Germany, it is in an embarrassing state. And generally, as we have analyzed, the EU is squeezed between the US and China. and is drawn into the trade wars which are developing worldwide. Just last month, the EU decided on new tariffs of 38% on electric vehicles from China, which would put the overall tariffs up to 48%, which is a reflection of European car makers lagging behind their Chinese competitors in regard to electronic vehicles. But obviously China will strike back. Also, Trump announced tariffs on EU products as part of his policy of more protectionism in case he wins the EU elections. And this means big dangers, especially for the EU economies, because they are heavily dependent on exports. So this means that Europe is very vulnerable and is in a weakened position, if you like, very vulnerable to a coming world economic crisis, which, as Hannah pointed out on Sunday, could be triggered by several different factors. Obviously, we do not know when a world economic crisis will hit, but we do know that even without it, the situation in Europe will be one of instability and uncertainties. And I think one could say that the only stable thing in Europe at the moment is this male Spanish national football team. And the only perspective I would bet on is that the English team will not win a tournament. I couldn't resist that, but my team is Croatia. We will also never win a tournament. But what we can expect is that the situation in the different states of Europe, but also the situation of the European Union, will get more fragile, unstable, crisis-ridden, and polarized. We have always explained that the EU is an alliance of different capitalist nation states, and that it will not be possible that these nation states will be overcome and that the EU turns into something like a superstate. I think that is quite clear to everyone today if you look at the EU. But in the past, we had to argue that against other forces on the left and to a certain extent even within our own organization. And yes, the EU is still there, and apart from Brexit, was not torn apart yet. But our general analysis and perspectives have been vindicated. And this includes that the very question of the survival of the EU or the Eurozone or both can be posed again in the coming period on the basis of crisis and class struggles and political developments. And this can be the existence of the EU in the form as it is today, or the Eurozone can be threatened both from economical but also from political developments or a combination of both. As we said many times, a new sovereign debt crisis is possible. The EU will this year hold excessive deficit procedures against 7 member states because their budget deficit exceeds the newly agreed regulations of 3% per GDP and the overall debt of not more than 60% of GDP. And these 7 EU countries are not the smallest ones. It includes France, Italy, Belgium, Hungary. And French and Italian bond yields have gone up this year. And there is already discussion amongst economists about the possibility of a new euro crisis being triggered by one of these countries. And comrades can imagine that such a crisis would be of a completely different quality than the Greek crisis more than 10 years ago, given the size of these economies of France or Italy. But a euro or EU crisis could also come from political developments like the strengthening of the populist right, an increase in the class struggle, but also from effects of geopolitical changes. The fragility of the EU was reflected in the European Parliament elections, but also, as was mentioned already before, for example, in the ongoing conflicts between Orban and the rest of the EU. And it is almost farcical sometimes. I mean, these visits from Orban to China and to Russia, clear provocations in regard to the rest of the EU, and as was explained before, the EU not even being able to find a common response to that. When at the end of last year, at the EU summit, there was an agreement to start entry negotiations with Ukraine, this was only possible because Orban made a coffee break during the vote and left the room. But it's one thing if Orban steps out of line. It will be another thing if other countries follow. And more dangerous, for example, could be the new government in the Netherlands, which consists of right-wing and right populist parties, which has already announced that they are not willing to stick to the EU agreements on migration and climate change measures. Also, a Trump victory would add more strains on the EU politically and economically. As Sonja explained on Sunday, China is already intervening into Europe via Hungary, Serbia, other places, ports, and so on. And it is true, Italy pulled out of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative last year, but only yesterday it was reported in the news that Italy, Meloni is in China at the moment, that Italy now wants to develop closer trade links with China again. And if Trump increases tariffs on EU goods, if the debt crisis develops and other developments, it is not ruled out that different EU or other European states could turn more towards China again. Now, all of this depends on many different factors. It is impossible to make concrete predictions. We can only analyze the general trend of developments, prepare ourselves for different eventualities. And it's clear that one factor is how the Ukraine war will develop. Will it, if or when it will come to an end in the sense of being frozen at a certain stage? Because that might open up a new possibility for countries to turn more to trade with Russia or China again. But even if this happens, and it will happen sooner or later, this does not mean peace. It does not mean an end to the militarization in Europe, or an end to the threat of military conflicts and wars. The Balkans could turn into a battlefield again with national tensions brewing there. With the prospect of an entry into the EU more or less gone for Serbia, we see more discussions in Serbia again to create a greater Serbia, incorporating the Serbian-dominated areas in Bosnia and northern Kosovo. The Serbian president, Vučić, recently made statements praising Azerbaijan's patience to wait for the right circumstances to take back Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was a clear message. The message was, we are waiting for the right circumstances to come to take back, in their view, the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and northern Kosovo. So this could become the next proxy war between the different imperialist blocs in Europe and even closer to Western Europe. Now, this year we've seen the European elections, and I think that we have to see the result of these elections and also of the elections in different countries in the light of the economic and political background which I have tried to outline. The elections meant a strengthening of the populist right. They received more votes and they have more members of the European Parliament now. In a number of countries, they have become the strongest force or the second biggest force. And as we have discussed in previous discussions, there's also a tendency for right-wing populist parties to enter governments, like recently happened in the Netherlands. We also see the emergence of such forces in countries where they did hardly exist before. Now we have relatively strong right populist forces in Portugal and Spain, and not yet on the parliamentary level, but on the streets, an increase or a strengthening of the far right, even in Ireland. But as I said before, I think it would be wrong to speak of a simple shift to the right, both in regard to the election results and more importantly in regard to the general situation in society and in regard to the class balance of forces. I think it is still correct to analyze the situation as one of polarization, in which the polarization to the left is not, or rather less, reflected on the political level. But elections are just one form and a low form of class struggle, and they are just a snapshot of the mood in society. And I think that when we discuss the European elections, we should stress the following points. There was a very low turnout, 51%. And that means that a big part of the population did not take the offer to express their alienation and dissatisfaction by voting for the populist or far right. Then there are millions of migrants who have no right to vote. And that means, for example, that in reality, the 15.9% for the alternative for Germany, in Germany in the Euro elections, are actually less than 10% in regard to the overall adult population. The populist right did especially well in countries where left parties sold out over the last period and disappointed workers and youth. Notably Spain, Portugal, Germany, Greece, or in countries where no strong alternative to the left of social democracy exists, like in Austria. They did actually do less well in a number of countries where they were either officially or unofficially part of the governments in the last period. Poland, Finland, Sweden. And we also have seen left-wing successes in the Euro election, in cases where the left-wing parties are not yet seen as part or as much seen as part of the capitalist establishment. That was the case in Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark. In Belgium, we also had a strong increase of the vote for La France Insoumise in France, more than 1 million votes more than in the previous elections. And also for the Communist Party in Greece, almost a doubling of their vote. And even in Austria, we've seen electoral successes of the Communist Party of Austria on regional and local level. And for the first time, there is a possibility, at least, that the Communist Party could enter the national parliament in the elections in October. And without going too much into that, I think that we have to be aware of these processes with a critical mind, but it also means that we need a certain orientation or a certain intervention into these organizations, or that this at least can make sense. I think the overall the results point to a turning away of voters from the established traditional bourgeois and social democratic parties, either to the populist right, in some countries to left parties, and overall to not participating in elections at all. And we have discussed the reasons for the growth of the populist right many times, and I will not repeat that in detail. We have pointed to the different political topics which they can exploit, and still migration is the number one political issue. Others have come to that as well, especially the culture wars they are waging, the question of the costs for climate change measures. And it is also still the case that the populist and far-right votes are mainly protest votes, and that not all the voters are racist or follow right-wing ideology or support the programs and propaganda of these parties. But we also have to see that this is also not standing still. In many countries, they are not a new phenomena anymore. They were able to sink organizational and political roots in parts of society. That is certainly the case with the Rassemblement National in France, with the Freedom Party in Austria, and also with the Alternative for Germany. There were surveys after the Euro elections in Germany which showed that the number of voters who said they voted in favor of the Alternative for Germany rather than against the other parties is growing. And this is a warning to the working class and to the left. And when we speak of polarization, polarization means a strengthening of two poles in society. And if the left fails, if no mass workers' parties are built, the populist right can be the main beneficiary in the next period. And we also have to be aware of the danger that in the wake of the electoral successes of the populist right, far-right, neo-fascist forces can grow again who turn violently against migrants, Muslims, Jews, LGBTQ+ people, and also the workers' movement and the left. This is an element in the situation in France, certainly in Ireland and in other countries as well. Now, the drama which unfolded in France over the last weeks led to an electoral success for the new Popular Front and gave, as the French comrades called it, the working class and the left a breathing space. There were celebrations on the streets after the second round of the elections and the defeat for Macron and the fact that the RN did not win. And we should call a success, and it is okay to be pleased about such an outcome and also to celebrate it a bit. But also here we need to have a sense of proportion and look beneath the surface. Because unfortunately, the RN, the populist right, was not stopped or really defeated in France. They were just stopped from getting the overall majority this time, which was for the first time seen as a possibility. But they were strengthened, and they are still on the upward curve. And I think it is clear, unless a mass workers' party is built, unless Mélenchon, France Insoumise would take such steps, whatever the outcome of the governmental open situation which is there now is, it is very likely that the RN will benefit from it. And others on the left now celebrate the new Popular Front as the model to stop the far right and the populist right. And amongst others, this includes our ex-comrade Paul Murphy in Ireland, who is now with the People Before Profit Alliance, an alliance with the SDA. They sent a letter to Sinn Féin arguing to follow the example of the new Popular Front in France to create a left-wing alliance, including Sinn Féin, saying France shows the way. But this is a dangerous way. I mean, reformism carries betrayal within itself. But the Parti Socialiste and the Greens in France are not even reformist. I mean, it's an insult to every real reformist to call them reformist. I think the situation which had developed in France in the last weeks is an example that we have to, on the one side, defend our program, maintain our independent socialist class position, but that we cannot do that just abstractly. On the other side, we have to deal with and relate to the concrete real situation which develops if we like it or not. Now, we are opposed to an alliance with the Parti Socialiste and the Greens. We were that when the alliance was NUPES, and we are now in regard to the New Popular Front. We argue that France Insoumise should take steps to launch a mass workers' party on a socialist program. But this is not what they are doing. And despite the fact that they are not doing that, they are still at the moment the main reflection of working class anger, combativity on the political level, which is reflected by the tens of thousands, I don't know the figure, 60,000 or more now, which have joined La France Insoumise in the last weeks. And therefore, despite the fact that we are not in favor, or we were not in favor of launching the New Popular Front, I think the comrades had no choice in the given situation to call for votes for the NPF candidates, and at the same time find ways to express our criticisms, our proposals for struggle. And this was especially the case in the new situation which opened up after the first round, with the realistic danger of the Rassemblement National winning the second round. And there was an understandable feeling amongst the most advanced layers of workers and youth that the most important thing is to prevent that. And our comrades also said that an RN victory would have had the effect of a defeat on the workers and youth. It would have worsened the conditions to struggle. Now, the French comrades in discussion I had explained to me that the question of the second round, the question of La France Insoumise stepping back in constituencies where they were in the third place in the first round, that this was not the main problem for workers and youth they were engaging with. And I think that is logical given the consciousness and given the idea that now the RN had to be stopped. And it would not have been our policy to do that, but also we have to decide what to concentrate our fight upon. And the most important thing in the present situation is to argue in regard to France Insoumise against the participation in a pro-capitalist government, exposing the nature of the PS and the Greens, and making proposals for a program and a battle plan to fight both the RN and Macron. And one central aspect of such a program is the demand for a mass workers' party on a socialist program, and put the responsibility to Mélenchon and France Insoumise, who are in a position to launch such a party. And this means a political fight against Mélenchon's left populist ideas, because he very clearly says that he's not launching a party because a party means a party represents a class, and he's just doing a movement because this is about the people against the elites. And we have to combat such ideas. And at the same time, we have to, as the comrades do, put forward transitional demands which have a clear class, which are clear class demands, show the necessity of breaking with capitalism, and call on the trade unions and France Insoumise to prepare for battle. As our comrades also have already done after the Euro elections, where it was our comrades who put forward motions in the trade unions to prepare a 48-hour strike. Now, moving to the UK, the election result there was, I think, almost exactly how our comrades expected it. In the IEC resolution from January, we said that it is not a question if the Tory government will fall, but when. And in his contribution on Sunday, Clive already gave the most important information and analysis about that election. It was a landslide victory for Labour, but only based on the number of seats because of the electoral system and not based on the number of votes. One commentator said, Labour's support is a mile wide, but an inch deep. And comrades heard the low turnout, the lowest number of combined votes for Labour and Tories for decades. I think our comrades were also vindicated in their approach to argue for what they called workers' lists. to call on the trade union leaders, on Jeremy Corbyn and others to stand in an organized way to lay the basis for a new Workers' Party. And Corbyn's election and the election of other independents and Green Party MPs is a reflection of that potential. And it is really criminal that Corbyn does not seize that opportunity. And I read an article from him in The Guardian where he's arguing for a strategy of building local movements, as he calls it, first before launching a party. He gives a picture of a fantastic people's power movement in his constituency of Islington. And then he said in that article, once our grassroots model has been replicated elsewhere, this can be the genesis of a new movement capable of challenging the stale two-party system. However, to create a new centralized party based around the personality of one person is to put the cart before the horse. Comrades, what a misjudgment of the situation and the dynamics in politics where timing is essential. It is neither possible to wait for the perfect conditions, opportunities must be seized. But it's also nonsense that the only option for a new party is a centralized party around one person. But certainly, as the comrades have explained, a new period is opening up in the UK, which puts the question of a new Workers' Party more on the agenda again. But also in the UK, the results of the Reform Party is a warning. And it is true that they did not make a qualitative and not even a quantitative leap forward in comparison to previous elections. But now they have a block of MPs. They are on the stage now, if you like. And if the opportunities are not seized on the left, they can benefit from that. And I think one important aspect of that election is also the class composition of votes in regard to Labour. I read one article, I think also in The Guardian, which made very clear that Labour was not elected by the workers, by the most oppressed. And this article says, or speaks of, a political system built on disfranchisement. If you are personally affected by the two-child benefit cap, have no hope of getting on the housing ladder, have no pension, savings, capacity to take on huge loans for training or higher education, then your future is cancelled. And politicians are banking on that sense of futility to keep you away from the ballot box. And it says, people now exist for whom working hard and playing by the rules will never pay off. And comrades, such a situation is a recipe for upheavals, riots, rebellions, and revolution. But it can also be a recipe for a further strengthening of the right. In discussions we had in Germany about the specific situation in Eastern Germany, one comrade said that one reason for the strength of the populist right is that the experience of East Germans since the restoration of capitalism is that playing by the rules gets you nowhere. And the increasing preparedness to not play by the rules must be channeled by us into the direction of a socialist and revolutionary politics. It's clear that this Starmer government will not have a honeymoon. The maximum will probably be a wait-and-see approach, which can be shattered as soon as the first attacks come. And they will come. The vote on the two-child benefit cap, and then the suspension of the 7 Labour MPs who voted in favor of removing that cap, shows the direction of travel. And I think that in Britain, as in many other countries, we will see conditions developing for very sharp class battles in the next period. And that the British finance minister has now discovered black holes in the state finances is just an attempt to scale down expectations and to prepare for cuts and attacks. And I think the combination of a continuation of the cost of living crisis, which is still there despite of lower inflation rates, with an economic crisis which will force upon governments to move in the direction of attacks against the working class in terms of cuts, but also in terms of workers' rights, plus the re-emergence of job losses, redundancies, closures of factories. This combination is what we will see in the future, and this will lead to an increase in the class struggle. In Germany, we have a permanent government crisis, but we also had the most tumultuous beginning of the year imaginable. In January, February, we had mass protests by farmers, blockading motorways and so on. Strikes in public transport, other strikes, and then millions on the streets against the populist right. And it shows just a society in ferment. Is that the word, ferment? Yeah. Now, it's not ruled out that the three-party coalition, which is governing Germany, Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, that they will not survive this year. We have state elections in 3 federal states in East Germany in September, and they will probably create a completely new political situation. The Alternative for Germany will most certainly become the strongest party in all the 3 states, and a newly founded party, which labels itself left conservative, it's called Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW. They will certainly make a breakthrough in that elections, probably becoming 2nd or 3rd force. They received 6% at the Euro elections. And that is a right-wing split-off from the left party, which is a peculiar mixture of right-wing and left-wing populism. It's anti-migration, explicitly pro-market on the one side, but then comes across as being the clearest force against the Ukraine war, comes across as being anti-establishment and expressing in a radical way the economic demands of ordinary people. Within the left party, there was a struggle going on with these forces for years prior to the split. And some in the left party said, no, they are gone, now we are back. But the opposite is the case. The decline electorally continues, and this is largely because of a completely unprincipled bloc alliance which the reformist left did with the right wing of the party. And in such alliances, it's always the right wing which will win. And in that sense, there's a shift to the right going on in the party, not always in terms of what they say on paper, but in the real politics, which also meant that we had to change our approach to a certain extent. We're still part of the left party, but it's not our main focus anymore. I think one comrade Max will explain that more in the discussion. But what will happen in September is that we will have a situation where in these federal states, probably the left party and government parties will be kicked out of some of the federal state parliaments, will not get the 5%. And then it's very likely that at least in 1 or 2 cases, the only possible government coalition which could get a majority without the populist right would be either a coalition of the conservative CDU with the left party or of the conservative CDU with the newly BSW, left conservative, Sarah Wagenknecht party. And that is a recipe for instability, crisis, and new elections, what have you. And then the federal government cannot agree on a common policy. And this, with the background of the weak economic situation, Germany is like the sick man of Europe, again, between stagnation and recession, as I said. 60,000 jobs were already lost in the car industry in the last, I'm not sure, 5 or 6 years. And at the moment, there's one announcement of job losses after the other. Now, given the fact that there's at the same time a lack of labor, people who lose their jobs might not end up all in unemployment, but in less well-paid jobs. And at the same time, the capitalists, the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party are all campaigning for sharper attacks on social benefits, on the right to strike, on working hours, etc. And it's very likely that the bourgeois, sooner or later, will want a change in government to a conservative-led government which could implement such attacks. And we have started a campaign arguing that the trade unions must now organize the fight against the cuts which are already there and must now prepare for the big round of attacks, which is very likely. And some said we are too early. And in a way we are a bit early, but we are sounding the alarm bells. And it puts us into a position now to get in contact with the most thinking trade unionists and to prepare, to have a bigger influence in the future. But I think this is what we have to prepare for in a number of countries. Attacks, cuts, job losses, and the fight against that. Greece has just recently introduced the 48-hour week and 6-day week. And that means, in my view, that we will not only see the kind of strikes we have seen in the last 2 years on pay and conditions. That will go on. They were largely protest strikes in the institutionalized framework of collective bargaining negotiations. But I'm absolutely sure that in addition to that, we will see bitter struggles again in workplaces, in specific companies, against redundancies, against factory closures, for trade union rights. And I think comrades should look at Sweden, at the Tesla strike, and the international repercussions of that strike, and look at Firenze in Italy, at the GKN strike, which was going on for, I think, 2 years, as examples of bitter class battles which are coming. And the strike wave, which we have seen in Britain and Germany, but also some other countries in the last 2 years, I think we were right when we said this marked the coming back of the working class. And by the way, this is part of the polarization in society, which is not reflected on the electoral level. But these were hundreds of thousands who newly joined trade unions. Millions who made their first experiences with collective action, with class struggle, with solidarity. And it didn't matter if the workmates were black, white, migrants or not. And we said this is only the beginning of the process, and it's also not in a straight line. And at the moment there's a bit of a dull there, but this process has begun. And it might not have led yet to the development of broader oppositions in the trade unions against the bureaucracies, but there is the beginning of a new layer of trade union activists, which make experiences with the strikes and with the ending of strikes. In the votes in Germany, which were done after the trade union leadership came to agreements with the employers, they won all these votes, despite the fact that the deals were not very good. But there were big minorities voting against the deals. And our impression now is that the trade union leaderships are drawing conclusions from that and trying to lower expectations in the next wage rounds and lowering the demands. But this can lead to conflicts in the unions. If the trade union leaderships now come and say, oh no, the last time there was so much dissatisfaction, now we have to have lower demands, there can be a layer of trade union activists who will stand up to this. And I think in a number of sections, we have already seized the new opportunities which are developing out of these class struggles. In Northern Ireland, our comrades played a central role in the biggest strike in history which took place in January. And we took the majority of the leadership in NIPSA, a left majority again. Same is the case in the PCS in Britain, where our comrades played an important role in reconquering a left majority in the PCS, National Committee, National Executive Committee. And in Germany, we are in a position that for the first time for many years, we now have a certain periphery again around us in the broad left organizations which we are working in. Now, trade union struggles are decisive for us for reasons which I do not have to explain here, but they are not the only way the class struggle or mass movements will develop. There are other important issues where the resistance will not develop through the trade unions. Housing is one of them. Obviously, issues like education, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, the environment, the Gaza war, all this does lead and will lead to movements. And then in some countries or in some situations, mass movements will develop around issues which surprise us, like in Spain, where there are mass movements against mass tourism. But I think one other aspect needs special attention, and that is council cuts in local services and infrastructure, because that will explode given the economic situation and the high level of debts. And this can often give us, as a small organization, the opportunity not just to intervene in a battle, but to initiate it, to lead it, and to make very important experiences. As Tony said on Sunday, we also have to be prepared to a new wave of youth radicalization, including forms of direct action or eco-terrorism, which we have already seen with the blockades of motorways and airports, or with the attack on the French railways. Now the French know how it feels in the German railways. Doesn't need arson attacks in Germany not to get your train. And we have to reach out to this radical youth, but without giving in to their impatience and to their ultra-leftism. And that will mean that initially we will not reach all of them, because they won't understand. That is an experience I think a lot of comrades make in the anti-war movement. But it needs patience on our side to explain our program, to explain that the only way is to organize the working class to take power. Okay, much more can be said, but I hope that other comrades will add to the discussion. Also, just to make these points in regard to the new quality of militarization. And that's not only arms programs, it's militarization of society. And also in regard to the Bonapartist tendencies which are developing. And both of these things can also trigger protests and mass movements at a certain stage. The comrades from England and Wales said that they feel that they have the best conditions for building the organization now for decades. And I can understand that this is the case in the UK. And it is maybe not yet the case in all countries, but that does not mean that conditions wouldn't exist in which we can build. There's no reason that we do not grow in any country in the world. The German section has doubled its membership since the split. We're 162 now. We're aiming to get 200. With that come a lot of challenges in terms of political education, developing a cadre. But in the future, we will be in positions where we can grow in leaps, where it will not be anymore about just winning the ones, twos, threes. And we have to make sure, and it's the primary responsibility of the comrades here in this hall, that this will happen on a solid theoretical and political basis and also on a solid class basis. Comrades, capitalism means horror without end. If something is clear, then that there's no future under capitalism. We've decided, every one of you decided, to fight for and to win a future for mankind through achieving socialism. This is not an easy task. But for me, the quote of the week was what Josh said in the last discussion. The difficulty of a task has no bearing on its necessity. And the only justifiable conclusion we can draw from the fact that a task is difficult is to fight even harder to achieve it. And that is not easy, but at the same time, as Trotsky said, it is the most satisfying thing you can do with your life. And Jenny Marx said, there is no happiness without rebellion. So comrades, let's rebel, let's be happy, and let's build the CWI.